But I'm Courtney McGeechee. I'm the director of the UN Decade Collaborative Center based here at the aquarium, so I too get to see the belugas every day. So now we are going to be hearing from Dr. Michelle Tehlar, hope I said that right, about the role of blue foods might play in low carbon future. So Dr. Michelle is a research scientist with Center for Ocean Solutions at Stanford University. She's an interdisciplinary climate scientist whose work focuses on the impacts of climate change on food systems, spanning the aquatic, terrestrial, ecological, and human interactions. Michelle obtained a master's in climate dynamics from Utrecht University and a PhD in oceanography from the University of Hawaii. At the Center for Ocean Solutions, she coordinated the Blue Food Assessment, an integrative assessment of the role of aquatic foods in transformation towards health, sustainable, just, and resilient food systems. Michelle is passionate about leveraging scientific findings for positive impact through policy engagement and strategic communication. Her work has also been covered extensively in media such as The Guardian, CBS News, The Atlantic, and PBS NewsHour.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I personally still can't get over the fact that we're here in a room with belugas and whale sharks, so thank you to human and non-human animal species alike for your patience as we got this presentation ready. So today I'm excited to bring all of you oceans and climate people into a third realm, that is the realm of food systems, and talk about the opportunities that oceans as purveyors of foods offer for thinking about low carbon futures. Wow. Multi-dimensional technical difficulties. Okay, so a brief outline of today's talk. First, I'll try to make the case for why we need to connect food, ocean, and climate agendas. Next, I'll discuss 4 blue food leverage points for decarbonizing food systems. And finally, I'll discuss some policy and partnership opportunities that are emerging on the horizon. So first, why do we need to talk about food in the context of climate and oceans? So very often when we talk about climate mitigation, discussions often focus on energy and transportation, but in fact it's really critical that we think about food systems in this context as well. Food systems contribute an estimated 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and in that way are a major driving force of climate change. And most of those emissions derive from the production of food directly, or from land use and land use change that is associated with food systems. And typically when we talk about food systems, people think about livestock and agriculture, but it turns out that fisheries and aquaculture in oceans, rivers, and lakes actually are really important components of our food systems as well. And over the last couple of years, there's been growing evidence on the important role that what we call blue foods or aquatic foods play in food and nutrition security, as well as the sustainability of global food systems. And one of these main pillars of evidence has been this work that I helped coordinate at Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions, which is a partnership between Stanford University and the Stockholm Resilience Center, as well as EAT, which was called the Blue Food Assessment. And this really aimed to highlight the many different roles that blue foods play in global food systems and global food systems of the future. And we published this Blue Food Assessment as a series of 9 different papers on different dimensions of this problem, including the nutritional composition of blue foods, their environmental performance, and the risk that climate change poses to their benefits. And today I'll be drawing heavily from the findings for this Blue Food Assessment for this talk. And it turns out that blue food systems are actually a really critical contributor to food and nutrition security the world over. So an estimated 3 billion people rely on fisheries and aquaculture as a main source of animal protein. And this is particularly the case in coastal and rural communities where, in the global south, where rates of malnutrition and nutritional vulnerabilities may be high. Similarly, there is an estimated 90% of actors in blue food production are actually considered to be small scale, and there is recent evidence by the Illuminating Hidden Harvest Initiative that was released last month showed that an estimated 500 million livelihoods depend on small-scale fisheries alone. So blue food systems are really critical both for food and nutrition security and from a livelihood perspective. Blue foods are not important only as a source of protein, but actually contribute many vital micronutrients, such as vitamin A, iron, calcium, zinc, and also omega-3 fatty acids. And these are nutrients that are particularly important for young children, for pregnant and lactating women, and for the elderly. And as such, blue foods can make really critical contributions to several public health challenges. So they can reduce micronutrient deficiencies generally, they can specifically support eye and brain health, and they can also reduce non-communicable diseases that are associated with overconsumption of red meat in particular. And over the last couple of decades, we've seen that blue food production around the world is rapidly growing from about 20 million tons in 1950 to nearly 118 million tons today. And since about the 1990s, the fisheries component of that has been relatively stagnant. But as you can see from this graph, aquaculture as a sector is rapidly growing, especially in East and Southeast Asia. And we see that the capture fisheries are mostly occurring in the marine realm, whereas aquaculture, more than half of it is actually happening in freshwater. And I pull up this slide of growing blue food production mostly to know that as food is a major part of climate and oceans are a major part of food, as blue food production grows in the future, it's really important to think about how that growth can actually support both our climate and nutrition goals, and how that growth can be done in such a way that it sustains the ecosystems that this blue food production depends on. And one key thing I wanted to note here is that blue foods are actually incredibly diverse. So when we think about terrestrial food systems, we very often think about a handful of crops and animals. When it comes to blue foods, there's more than 2,500 species around the world that are being fished and farmed. And on the one hand, this offers tremendous opportunity because it means that there is high diversity in nutritional profiles and in environmental footprints that may offer opportunities for more climate-friendly and nutritious food systems. On the other hand, it also means that there is no straightforward path for blue foods in low-carbon food systems, as all blue food systems look differently around the world. So now I wanted to highlight a couple of leverage points through which we think that blue foods can actually contribute to decarbonizing food systems. And for this work, I was really pleased to work with a student at Stanford University. Her name is Rebecca Spencer, and she helped to synthesize evidence around the role of blue foods in low-carbon food systems. And through her work, we identified 4 key leverage points. So the first leverage point focuses on shifting consumption patterns, both from carbon-intensive red meats to blue foods, and from high-emission blue foods to low-emission blue foods. The second leverage point revolves around improving the environmental performance of existing production systems. The third leverage point connects nicely to the previous talk, which revolves around the connections between blue foods and blue carbon systems. And the final leverage point that we identified is to better utilize and manage interactions between terrestrial and aquatic food system components. So first on dietary shifts. Dietary shifts are really a critical tool in our toolbox for decarbonizing global food systems. It's estimated that nearly half of all the emissions that come from food systems derive from meat and dairy production, and the largest share of that comes from beef production. And so reducing beef consumption around the world has been identified as a key leverage point in reducing food system emissions. And as you can see in this graph, generally blue foods perform much better than especially red meats when it comes to carbon emissions. And according to these estimates, wild fisheries produce on average per gram of protein 1/6 of the carbon emissions than beef production does, and aquaculture production produces approximately 1/10 that beef production does. So in principle, a shift from red meat to blue foods could reduce the dietary contributions of food systems, and there could be important co-benefits around reducing non-communicable diseases. A couple of key caveats that I wanted to note here. First of all, there is still significant uncertainty about the actual substitutability of red meat and blue foods for different consumers. So how willing are people to eat, say, mussels instead of a hamburger. The second key caveat I wanted to note is that it's really important to avoid what might be thought of as a surf and turf scenario, where efforts to increase blue food consumption really just lead to wealthy consumers eating more blue foods and not actually eating less red meat. And the final caveat I want to pose here, and I think this goes for all the things I'm talking about in today's talk, is that these kind of outcomes can only be achieved, of course, if the significant management and environmental challenges that are associated with blue food production are overcome. And secondly, I wanted to get back to that high diversity that we see in blue food systems. So this is a graph that is adopted from one of our blue food assessment papers on the environmental performance of different types of blue food species. And you see on the left, in blue, farmed species, and in the right, in green, wild capture species. And you see the range of carbon emissions associated with their production compared to that of chicken, which is shown in the brown box. And as you may remember from the previous graph, chicken is considered to be the most efficient terrestrial animal source foods. And we can really see high diversity in carbon emissions for different species. So if we look at wild capture species, it's particularly cod and also small pelagics like sardines and anchovies, which are not shown in this plot, that have really low carbon emissions associated with them. And for farmed species, it's really bivalves like mussels and oysters, as well as farmed carp that perform really well compared to chicken. On the other hand, if we look at species like flounders, they have significantly higher carbon emissions associated with them than, in this case, chicken or other blue food species. So those might need to be avoided in a low carbon blue food future. And then I also wanted to highlight that there is exciting opportunities for climate and nutrition win-wins here. There's a couple of species that perform really well, both in terms of nutritional density as well as in terms of carbon intensity. So those are, for instance, farmed bivalves and carps, as well as small pelagics. On the other hand, prawns and crustaceans, both farmed and fished, neither offer much nutritional density, nor do they perform particularly well in terms of climate. So it's really critical to keep this diversity in mind when thinking about what kind of blue foods can fit a low carbon future. And I also wanted to show this map from a recent paper we published in Nature, I think last month, that mapped where in the world different blue food policy objectives are relevant. And this map shows in particular where low carbon blue foods could be part of reducing food system emissions. And it made this map based on where in the world currently red meat consumption is high and where blue foods are readily available. And so those are the dark blue countries in this map. And in total, 124 countries actually match this profile. So this objective of reducing emissions through dietary shifts is relevant in many places around the world. Secondly, in addition to shifting behavior on the consumer side, there's also a lot of opportunities to change environmental performance on the production side. And I wanted to start off with fisheries here. So currently it's estimated that fisheries contributed about 4% to total food system emissions, and most of those emissions come from fossil fuel use. So when we think about reducing those emissions, it mainly means spending less time at sea, shifting to low fuel gears, or transitioning to low emission technologies. So in the first bucket, there's a study by the World Bank, Sunken Harvests, that tried to estimate what reductions in fishing efforts in the short term could mean for healthy fish stocks in the long term. And they estimated that such a reduction in fishing effort initially could ultimately lead to an increase in catch by 13%, with 56% of the effort. And that would lead to a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So just showing that fisheries management is a critical tool for reducing food system carbon emissions. Secondly, in aquaculture, currently contributes approximately 6% of total food system emissions, and a lot of those emissions are related to feed use and feed composition. So that's where really the opportunities are. Estimates recently on feed composition, which is typically a combination of both marine and terrestrial ingredients, shows that switching current soy ingredients with deforestation-free soy could reduce the emissions from feed by half. Similarly, there have been great advances in genetic selection and selective breeding for improving both the environmental efficiency as well as the climate resilience of different types of species. And especially in Atlantic salmon, we see that the feed conversion ratio, so how much feed do you need to produce, say, 1 kilogram of fish, has really come down by a lot. And only reducing the feed conversion ratio by, say, 10% can already bring down greenhouse gas emissions by a quarter. And finally, there's some really exciting opportunities around circular economies, so to adopt technologies to prevent overfeeding and also to repurpose and reduce waste. For instance, bivalve shelves can have many industrial applications in the form of calcium carbonate, but usually end up in landfills where they cause additional carbon emissions. And then finally, evidence suggests that about a quarter of total food system emissions actually derive from food loss and waste. And it's really difficult to estimate how much is wasted in fishery supply chains. That's mostly because definitions vary quite widely. For instance, is bycatch waste or not? But the FAO estimates that about 35% of blue foods are lost along their supply chains. So in addition to just looking at production practices, it will be really important to also look at storage and transportation and consumer and retail environments when thinking about reducing emissions from blue foods. The third lever that we identified really comes back to the previous talk that we saw about blue carbon, where Tyler showed that investing in the restoration and production of blue carbon ecosystems can support the storage and sequestration of carbon. And in principle, there is lots of synergies that might exist between blue carbon, sustainable blue foods, and climate. So healthy blue carbon ecosystems might support more healthy and productive blue food production systems, shifts towards consumption of low carbon blue foods and improving blue food practices could lead to climate mitigation, and generally a more stable climate will support blue carbon and blue food ecosystems alike. But here I really want to highlight that, at least to my knowledge, there's not been a lot of research into these exact relationships between blue carbon and blue foods, either on the ecosystem side, but also when we think about what does protecting and restoring blue carbon systems mean for access for coastal communities. How are we seeing current moves to monetize blue carbon for the purpose of meeting climate targets? How are those benefits shared with coastal communities, etc.? So I mostly wanted to include this lever as really a call to take a food systems lens to future thinking about blue carbon research and policy. And the fourth lever that we identified really revolves around the interactions between blue and green parts of the food system. And this diagram comes from a paper by Rich Cottrell in 2017, who really quite extensively mapped all of the different ways in which terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, food systems are linked. And there's two parts of that in particular that are relevant for our discussion around decarbonizing food systems. The first one is, again, this feed interlinkages. So both livestock and aquaculture feed have both marine ingredients and terrestrial ingredients, and all of those have significant sustainability challenges associated with them. So there are currently some exciting opportunities from land-based systems to improve, to swap out some of those feed ingredients. So that's thinking about things like duckweed or single-cell proteins or insect meal or chicken byproducts. So again, a lot of this circular economy thinking. And there's also some exciting opportunities for marine resources to contribute to livestock feed, especially macroalgae. Some research has shown that adding red macroalgae in particular to the feed of cattle can reduce their enteric methane emissions by half. Noting that, at least to my understanding, it's terribly difficult to grow red macroalgae, so that remains to be a challenge to figure it out. And then the second interaction here between blue and green systems that I wanted to highlight is that of pollution in waterways. So both agriculture and aquaculture create runoff that drives pollution and eutrophication in both where the production takes place and downstream. And not only does that harm the productivity of downstream ecosystems, but it also leads to additional greenhouse gas emissions in the form of nitrous oxide and methane. So really thinking about or limiting and managing pollution both from aquaculture and agriculture will be really important, not only to have thriving fisheries, but also to reduce greenhouse gas emissions more broadly. And as a socio-ecological scientist, I of course need to have my synergies and trade-offs slide. I really wanted to invite all of us to not think about food system solutions as just thinking about carbon. Of course, as I argued, food is a really big component of the climate challenge, but at the same time, the primary function of our food systems is to provide food and nutrition for people around the world. And so I think it's really important to think about, to ensure that efforts to support and expand the role of blue foods in low carbon food systems does not come at the cost of the food and nutrition security of the people who currently depend heavily on those systems, which would hamper efforts to meet, for example, sustainable development targets around zero hunger and good health and well-being. And similarly, as I highlighted earlier, there is about 500 million small-scale livelihoods that depend on blue food systems currently. And taking a climate justice lens to this issue would mean that technologies and investments aimed at reducing carbon emissions from food systems also benefit and reach those numerous actors. And then, of course, I, as a climate scientist, want to also know that climate change itself poses a significant threat to fisheries and aquaculture the world over. And so these opportunities for blue foods to contribute to low carbon food systems can really only occur with parallel investments in the climate adaptation and resilience of these production systems. And so then finally, a few words on what I see as significant policy and partnership opportunities in this space. So first of all, just wanted to note that investment in fisheries and aquaculture in the context of both food and climate action has been pretty underwhelming. So this graph shows what percentage of funding that was allocated to food by major development banks has gone to fisheries and aquaculture in the last 50, 60 years, and you see that generally it hovers between 0 and 5%. And similarly, there's numbers coming out looking at climate adaptation financing, suggesting that over the last 20 years, only 4% of climate adaptation financing has actually gone to fisheries and aquaculture. So there's a huge investment gap here. But we are trying to change this. So at Center for Ocean Solutions, we worked in 2021 to target the United Nations Food Systems Summit. That was a primary target of our blue food assessment work. And the goal here was really to get blue foods more firmly integrated into food policy. And one of the outcomes of this summit was the formation of different action coalitions around the world. So there's currently one around zero hunger, around sustainable consumption, around school meals. And there's also one called the Aquatic Blue Food Coalition. It has more than a dozen member states that are participating, as well as several civil society organizations. And together we have aimed to bring blue foods into high-level policy arenas and also to mobilize investment into blue food initiatives. And so over the last couple of years, we've gone to the Committee on World Food Security, we've gone to the CBD COP, we've gone to the Climate COP, and we're particularly excited for this COP28 upcoming in the United Arab Emirates, which is promising to really look at food and make some high-level commitments around food systems in the context of climate. And so our goal is to really ensure that blue foods are firmly integrated into any climate and food outcomes at this COP. A final partnership here that I wanted to highlight was that a few weeks ago, we were officially endorsed as a program under the UN Decade of Ocean Science. It's called Sustainable Blue Food Futures for People and Planet. And I would be really excited to talk with any of you here about collaborating either under the Coalition umbrella or the Decade umbrella on making sure that sustainable blue foods are firmly integrated into visions for climate-smart food systems. And I know I'm standing between you and lunch, so just a quick summary. So I hope I've argued convincingly that oceans are a critical part of food systems are a critical part of climate. I've identified these 4 leverage points for decarbonizing food systems in the form of dietary shifts, improving performance practices, blue carbon solutions, and blue-green interactions. And finally, I'm hoping that this space can really be a starting point for lots of collaborations on this issue. And I just wanted to note that in the next couple of days, we'll be publishing a white paper on these 4 leverage points and policy opportunities on our website at oceansolutions.stanford.edu. And really happy to take any questions or comments, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. That was beautiful talk, Michelle. I have a question. Why is it that the investments from all these world banks have not been so high in aquaculture and blue food production?
I think it's mostly because of the historical siloing of a lot of these different realms. So we see this in universities, in governments, and then also in development banks. So like governments typically have separate divisions for fisheries and aquaculture that are separate from agriculture and food. In universities, our oceans departments and our land food departments and our climate departments are also separated. So I think it's just that a lot of the people who are trained in food thinking and food investment just don't think of fisheries and aquaculture as food. They think mostly of them as conservation targets or economic value.
Thanks so much, Michelle. That was great. On the dietary shifts question in particular, I'm really glad you raised the 3 major challenges. And to that, or as a component of that, I'd add, why would we shift diets, given the difficulty of shifting diets? Why would you shift to, say, fish species instead of to vegetable protein and possibly, entomophagy if you're going to make what is a really difficult transition happen anyhow?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think it's important to take a sort of all of the above approach. I don't think that incorporating more low carbon blue foods into diet should come at the expense of increasing plant-based protein. I do think in certain places we might find that blue foods are more accessible or more affordable than what we think of as alternative protein. And also for certain consumer groups, certain types of blue food species might be more I guess reasonable or easily sort of reachable alternatives. But yes, I think it's a part of a portfolio and not an end goal.
Yeah, last question.
Okay.
Yeah, go. Hi, thank you for that talk. That was really interesting. And obviously blue foods is going to be a big part of our future, but I was wondering if you considered the concerns around the ongoing and increasing pollution in water, so high levels of mercury through bioaccumulation and then also microplastics, how that's going to come into play and even how we can avoid major health concerns moving forward with blue foods.
Yeah, thank you. So the question was around pollution, especially microplastics and mercury accumulation in blue foods as an additional health concern. So I'd say that yes, that's of course an important thing to keep in mind in our blue food assessment. The sort of negative health sides of blue foods weren't that brought to the fore. I'd say that mercury accumulation is typically an issue in high trophic level species, and so that might not necessarily intersect with what we think of as the low carbon or more sustainable blue food species, but it goes to a broader point of providing more detailed recommendations around what is both sustainable and nutritious blue food. So typically, even in like public health guidance, they just talk about it as fish, and so it's clearly very important to properly acknowledge the high diversity there. On microplastics, this is really an area that I personally don't know a lot about. Actually, just started working with a research assistant on synthesizing some of that evidence. It's clearly an important thing to keep an eye out on, and I think more broadly, just yeah, emphasizes the importance of thinking about various sources of pollution as a key of healthy and sustainable food systems.